Would you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When a young carpenter from the region of Galilee started preaching a message of radical compassion, more than a few eyebrows were raised. In the midst of Roman occupation, very few people had the time, energy, or inclination to care about anyone outside their own families and communities. And this was on purpose. When the people were too exhausted physically or emotionally to care about their neighbors, the Roman government had much more latitude to do whatever they wanted without protest. Compassion fatigue was the goal. But this new arrival on the scene, Jesus of Nazareth, taught his followers to show up for each other. He cared for and healed people without regard of their position or status, how much power or wealth they held, whether they were Jewish or not. Jesus selected people who were ordinary, poor, corrupt, religious zealots, people from all walks of life, to be his disciples and to form a community with each other, breaking past the barriers of their society. When those same disciples argued about which of them was most suited to lead, had the most power, Jesus redirected them to servant leadership. The first shall be last, and the last first. Jesus preached not just to the Jewish people, but to people of all cultures and religions and backgrounds, promising and delivering grace and mercy for all peoples. Much of the ministry and teachings of Jesus were centered on how people should treat each other and behave in community, to be faithful friends to God and one another. Jesus, even as God in human form, didn't pull all of this out of thin air. His teachings were built on a solid foundation of God's previous commands and laws to the Jewish people. Jesus frequently quoted the Jewish holy text, what we refer to as the Old Testament. In fact, many of God's laws, particularly in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, had to do with how to be a community and show up for each other in ways that were just and kind. The Israelites were given laws to welcome and care for orphans and widows, the disadvantaged, to treat immigrants and foreigners the same as they would native-born people, to deal fairly with each other in sales and loans, to actively work against injustices, and more. The list truly goes on. And truly, Jesus, as a human, demonstrated scholarly excellence when he stated that the greatest commandments were to love God and love your neighbor. After the death and ascension of Jesus, his disciples carried on his work in the world. Like the Messiah, the disciples preached to all peoples, converting anyone who would accept the word into their hearts. This resulted in a fast-growing, diverse community of believers, not all of whom had a firm root in the Jewish holy text or in the gospel of Jesus' teachings. And yet they prayed together, lived together, worshiped together, and just as the church today stumbled together. These people brought their histories and preconceptions with them. They brought questions that they wanted answers to, questions of who Jesus was, how to contribute to the church, what practices ought to be followed, and more. And in this early chaotic time, misinformation and disinformation arose far too frequently. We have lost the precise situation of the Galatian church. We are unsure of exactly what their question was, but it seems to have been a question of whether followers of Jesus had to follow the same practices as the Jewish community, such as circumcision, in order to be saved. Paul lays out an extremely thorough response in his letter to the Galatians, and this response is firm. The law passed down by Jesus Christ is sufficient for all. No ifs, ands, or buts. Paul also points out that the people who are convincing others to follow practices such as circumcision are doing so for their own benefit, to gain praise and honor within the community, and to avoid persecution from entities such as the Roman Empire. They are manipulating others to help themselves. And as such, Paul says these individuals are not following the law of Christ, the law of service and love. They are not participating in community or being friends in the ways that Jesus taught. It is clear in Paul's letter that he cares deeply for the congregation of Galatia. He expresses his desire for them to return to what he has previously taught them, to what he describes as the law of the Christ, or the law of the Messiah. And so after the first 4 chapters of the letter to the Galatians, in which Paul dismantles the arguments for any practices outside of the teachings of Jesus and lays down a very thorough theological argument that faith and belief in Jesus is all one needs, Paul concludes his letter with 2 further chapters describing how the community should be acting, how the people of Christ should be friends to each other. The law of Christ, Paul explains, requires a life of service in gratitude for the gifts we have been given, bearing each other's burdens. All in the church must practice care and compassion, especially towards those who have transgressed against or harmed God or other people. These people, Paul says, are to be gently lifted by the community to faithfully follow Christ once again on the right path. And Paul says this is the responsibility of the church for all those who fail. It is a failure of the congregation and of the church in its whole. Just as the success of one is the success of all. At every opportunity, Paul says, Christians are to do good to all people and especially each other. In other words, Christians show up. Misinformation, disinformation, and manipulation for personal gain, unfortunately, did not disappear from the world, even when Paul addressed them in the congregation in Galatia. Compassion fatigue did not cease to exist with the fall of the Roman Empire. These are challenges we face today, just a few challenges of many. In fact, while I was walking my dog this morning, I came across a flyer on the sidewalk. The back of it is pretty standard rapture language. The first line reads, "The end is near, and it's this year." And this is where I will say, Jesus warned us of those who would claim to know the end was near. And Jesus said, "They do not know, for no one but God knows. But in the meantime, this is how you are to behave: to love one another, to love the world, for all shall know who are Christians by their love." In the letter to the Galatians and in the whole of the Bible, we see this, that God's community does not end where challenges begin. We know that though there are some crazy theories out there, and you have to see the front of this flyer, it wasn't aliens, it was Jesus. I would have loved to have a conversation with whoever had those flyers and find out which things weren't aliens but were Jesus. But without context, I'd have to say I agree to an extent. Jesus showed up for us. Jesus in the Spirit is still showing up for us. And God calls us to show up for each other. God's love never ends, nor is ours to end. When we face adversity, when we face challenges, when we face fear and uncertainty, this is when showing up for each other is most important. Crucially, showing up is not the same as avoiding conflict altogether. When we see a wrong or a harm being committed, we are to speak out against it. Paul's letter to the Galatians is a perfect proof of this. It directly contradicts what part of the congregation believes and is practicing. But Paul's letter also encapsulates how Paul says these confrontations should occur, with deep care and compassion for those committing the wrong, to gently as possible, guide them back to being faithful to Jesus and faithful friends to their communities. Equally important is the note that God doesn't ask us for big, elaborate gestures or flashy demonstrations of goodwill. Showing up is, as Paul writes, doing good at every opportunity, no matter the size of that opportunity. Don't underestimate the power of a small gesture. When I was out of state last week and absolutely had to do laundry on the road and could find no machines except coin-operated, 3 separate people made change for me. And I'm not exaggerating when I say they will never know how much that really helped me out. Showing up is little gestures in addition to the larger ones. Showing up can be listening to someone, truly hearing them, calling a friend, volunteering in the community, asking open-ended questions so someone has the space to speak their truth, watering plants, going to that church meeting, sharing a meal, a ride, preparing coffee fellowship, fact-checking a post on Facebook, or adding a positive comment to a friend's post, sending a text just to check in, contacting your elected officials, giving a gift, saying hi to that one neighbor you have, complimenting someone. Truly, the list is endless of possibilities. Jesus said, "As you have done for others, so you have done for me." Bear each other's burdens and lift each other up. Paul writes that it is God's generous gift of grace and mercy that enables us to enact the law of Christ, the law of love, care, compassion, and faithful friendship. It ought to be no surprise that our generous and loving God gives us plenty of ways to show up.